You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
You're listening to the Show Jumping Podcast, a fun and informative show for riders, owners, trainers, grooms, and fans of all levels.
I'm Kristy McCormick in Saratoga Springs, New York.
And I'm Kimmy Carlson in St. Louis, Missouri.
And you're listening to the Show Jumping Podcast, where we deliver at-home riding exercises to our listeners and chat about the world of show jumping. Before we get started, a quick word from our title sponsor.
Reline GI is a natural, long-term alternative that goes beyond masking symptoms. This unique blend of gut-friendly hyaluronic and wellness-boosting beta-glucan works with your horse's body to soothe and protect their digestive system. Unlike traditional therapies that can disrupt digestion and nutrient absorption, Reline GI leaves your horse's natural balance intact. But don't take our word for it. Reline GI is field tested by leading veterinarians and backed by peer-reviewed research, including a study by Dr. Nathan Slovis, showing it effectively reduces gastric ulcers in active horses. Plus, it's Clean Sport certified and safe for competition use. Head over to resolvet.com. That's RESOLVET.com and use code SJP at checkout for 10% off, linked in our show notes.
Well, Kimmy, we are starting on another pod. Thanks for joining again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I thought today we'd talk about the idea of pressure and nerves while showing. I know we've had a little pre-chat about this, but why don't we start by just defining what pressure is and where it comes from in any competition.
Yeah, no, I really like this topic. I think it's something that is really universal, right? Within the horse world, there's some unique pressures and ways we get nervous while riding specifically, but it's so universal to being human, right? You with situations that you feel under pressure. And I think really there's kind of two main sources of pressure, right? There's what we put on ourselves and what gets put on us. And sometimes those are very, very difficult to sort of separate from one another. Right. One builds on the other. I think that's really common, especially as young competitors, to have external pressures sort of manifest then as internal pressures. So I think it's important to kind of define where that pressure is coming from and what the goal is of applying pressure. Because I think like nerves, pressure gets this sort of maybe a bad reputation, and it's not in and of itself, I don't think, a bad thing to say.
I agree.
This is an important moment, and we're going to really focus, and we're going to put a lot of effort, and that focus and effort sort of becomes pressure, right, on the situation of this is the consequences of this class or the importance of this moment is more than sort of your everyday, whether it's riding or competing or something else. But I also think it's not sustainable, right? You have to kind of pick and choose what you focus on and where you create that pressure. Otherwise, it can get very run down by just sort of being under pressure all the time.
Right. You can't have it all the time, but you need a little, I find it motivating, you need a little bit of it to say, this means something, not just to, a goal you're working towards, but when you're in that moment, it's sort of a self check-in of, am I really ready? Have I sort of, have I really put in the work and the effort? And can I use all of that homework that I've completed and showcase what I've done? And I think a lot of, I certainly deal with this as a trainer with a lot of students that react differently under pressure. We all react differently. Some students, are just, they have what you would say nerves of steel, right? Or they have, cold blood in their veins, it seems, and nothing seems to bother them. And I think, you brought up a little earlier before we started that nerves are part of this, right? And your reaction, anybody's reaction to pressure that results in being nervous is pretty normal. And I think that can go into competing, that can go into, places in life where we're just trying to perform really well, right? I think that being nervous is just a part of being human.
Yeah. And I want to kind of maybe put an earmark in your comment about like preparation and preparedness and how
Yeah.
it plays into how we get nervous, maybe for a little bit later. Cause I think that's kind of in some ways at the core of a lot of it in terms of the outcomes of how we react to different types of being nervous. And I've noticed, right, with sort of pressure and nerves specifically, the types of situations that you get nervous and the way you get nervous really is very similar in very different situations, right? The way I got nervous under pressure, sitting at the end gate of the McClay finals, as I, through adulthood and grad school and work, is all of a sudden you notice that, oh, that's kind of the same way I get nervous before I give a conference talk, right?
Yeah.
That's the same, or even before I have sort of a, kind of a vulnerable conversation with somebody. If it's like physically, there's sort of that same sort of nervousness, which I think is super interesting. And it in such different situations, you kind of get the same physical manifestation of that pressure and that nerves and learning. So I think learning to deal with it in any of those situations becomes very helpful and becomes very sort of translatable across those.
Can you talk about, as a competitor, physically what you felt? And like we said, everybody reacts differently, but when you felt nervous, first of all, what was that timing like in terms of what you felt leading up to an event and what you felt maybe right before it, or even actually in the class during it?
Mm-hmm.
And how did that feel?
Yeah, I know. I really like the timing question. That wasn't really something I thought about. I'll start with saying, and I think I said this kind of about pressure in general, I think nerves get a little, I think they get demonized a little bit of like, oh, it's, don't get nervous. I don't want to be nervous.
You don't need to be nervous.
And
it's okay,
I'll start by pushing back against that. I think nerves are super useful. I think they're, right, it's adrenaline, right? I think kind of learning to harness that energy and that adrenaline and that focus in a positive way or in a way that's useful to you so there's sort of this good nervous versus bad nervous, I think, but that's kind of later. First, just physically for me, and I think everyone's a little different here, which is fun. It's fun to talk about. You've eaten spaghetti, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And so, you take the fork and you like twirl it around.
Yeah.
The spaghetti, and it sort of like twists and twirls and like torques in. For me, it's just that I feel that like in my kind of core, like my abdomen, that's sort of just like, sort of twisting, tightening pressure. It's almost like I'll do a crunch, just sort of this like, inward physical tightening of kind of the whole middle of my body. And so it's a very specific, once you sort of recognize it, it's like this very specific, unique, like yawning, like this physical response to being nervous. I tend to get nervous right before. So when I'm on deck, right? When I'm sitting.
You're next to go in the ring. Yep.
Or even maybe like one out, right? Like that moment before that's when I first feel that. And then that really, for me, once I walked in the ring or like picked up a canner, that kind of dissipated, that kind of translated into more that like mental focus versus that like physical, nervousness. But that's, again, I think that's unique to each person of like, when do you get nervous? Hours out? Do you get nervous while you're actually cantering to the first jump?
Yeah.
And so when do you feel it in your body versus when do you is it more of a mental sensation of being nervous? For me, it was very much a physical thing, and then kind of this mental focus and sharpening most of the time, sort of the good nervous. But I know there were times when I felt, especially when I felt really unprepared, right? Circling back to that, is it kind of goes the other way, and you get sort of this more frantic, everything kind of speeds up nervous of, oh dear, versus the having everything kind of slow down and help you focus. And so I think I do, fortunately for me, I tended to get kind of that more focused, slow, nervous, if you will, that effect of being nervous. But there were moments when I had that very like frantic, oh dear, everything kind of felt too fast and I felt unprepared. And if that is what I sympathize with folks who maybe that's more their natural reaction, because that is way less fun than
that's me actually.
The
I don't know if we've ever talked
and slowing of everything.
That's so interesting now, because I don't think you and I have ever talked about how we compare with our nerves. Mm-hmm. I do remember teaching you, and I would know if you were nervous when you would sort of get internal and quiet. Mm-hmm. And at times I didn't quite know or before I could figure it out, if you were like absorbing the course, or I needed to explain it more, or, just how we were communicating was. Sometimes I felt like I was talking to somebody who was a little bit in outer space, but you were processing your nerves, and you were in a space where probably everything was slowing down. And I really admired how actually you did that, because my reaction to nerves is to rush and to get, a little spun and wound up. And I do still, I have felt the internal stomach kind of twisting. And my reaction is to like, fire through that. And sometimes I would do things like, gallop too fast to a jump, or, see a distance and not be patient and just, try to leave it out. And that could be schooling, that could be even in the class if I carried it in there. But I do know that my reaction to being nervous is, and certainly you're right, nerves come from pressure. I think the time I've ever been the most nervous was not on the class day itself, but the weeks leading up to when I was doing catch riding for Jen Alfano for Derby finals, which by the luck of the skies, somehow that class all came together and we won, which was not my goal. My goal was just to not embarrass myself. And that's the pressure I put on me. I mean, I didn't even think about other people thinking I should win or even do well. I just wanted everyone to feel like I had pressure from other people, or that I thought was from other people, on I was good enough to play that role. Mm-hmm. And that tore me up for weeks leading up to that event. And I had a pretty good sort of breakthrough the week before. This is a week before the actual event. I'm not even at the horse show yet.
That's so far away. That's so long to be nervous.
And I was like crying and, very emotional, and had to talk through it with some people close to me about how, you know what, you're being put in a really hard position for this particular event, and you're already a really good rider, and nobody would have asked you to do it if you weren't good enough. So just go in and ride. And I had to have a bit of an eye-opening moment before I walked in there to say that, or to realize that. And then though, once that perspective was set, I was really good once I was at the event of just, now it's almost all out of my control. I already know, I've done the preparation to know what I have in my control. Everything else I can't control. So I can control me. I feel good about that. And that's how I want to be. And that kind of pressure can be taxing. That's for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's very easy to get, I think we don't have these kinds of conversations enough, frankly. It's very easy again to sort of say, oh, nerves are bad, just, either don't be nervous or try to sort of these, so much of what I heard, were ways to not be nervous, right?
Yes.
And it's like that shit doesn't work, right? It's like that. And I think that does a disservice to, like, these are here for a reason, right? You're nervous for a reason. You're nervous because this is, a big deal, whether it's a big deal today or whether it's a big deal, sort of more something that's going to have an effect on your life for a while.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think really, really understanding and a little bit more, being a little more welcoming to those feelings and that nervousness, and being like, oh, okay, I'm glad you're here. Let's figure out how to like harness this into a way that I can, that is useful to me, as opposed to, negative on my performance. Is It should be more of the conversation versus just the like, don't be nervous. Like, that's
Right.
not actionable at all.
Right. How do you not be nervous? How do
I
you do
think I
that?
think nerves
Can't.
I think yeah, nerves can be good.
Well, and nerves mean you care. Nerves
Yeah.
mean whatever's happening, you care about in some fashion. And whether you care about it just for that moment, whether you care about it for the long term or for yourself, I think that's a positive. And you should recognize, I remember even doing a national derby, which I've done, I don't even know, countless numbers of them on a horse. This was at a horse show in Aiken a couple years ago, on a horse that was owned by a client. I had shown him in multiple classes. I had won multiple classes on him. It should have been a cakewalk. And I thought that way in the first round. And I just kind of cruised around and we had a nice round. And, I'm coming back on top. And and a national derby for what I've competed in is sort of this, and I don't mean this the way it sounds like, oh, it's nothing, but it should be a no-brainer for me, right? My job as a professional rider to do very big classes, and and I have done Grand Prix and I have done international derbies and things like this. So a national derby should have been just a easy peasy, have a fun day. And I remember saying out loud in the schooling area, "Oh my God, I'm so nervous," before the second round, and all it just reminded me was, that's great because I care about how I do. And then I was able to kind of turn that into focus. So I think that's maybe a strategy of just recognizing that you are nervous. And you're right. Say, okay, now that's great. I'm here. What do I do now? And how do I turn that into focus and not wasted nervous energy? I think wasted energy when you're competing can lead to a lot of mistakes. And that's obviously what everyone's trying to avoid, is making mistakes while they're performing.
Yeah. And I think especially with the horses component of this, and we touched on this a little bit a few episodes ago, but just how your nerves manifest, especially physically, are going to have an effect on, especially if they happen, while you're riding, while you're sitting at the end gate. If you're that very sort of fast, frantic, nervous energy, as sort of we think of as nervous energy, right? That kind of high frequency, vibrating, that's going to have an effect on your horse. Maybe if you have a real cold-blooded horse, that's maybe what they need. But if you're sitting on something that's a little more sensitive, that's really gonna affect what they're feeling and how they perform, versus being able to, again, manage yourself and your own emotions and your nervousness to not transfer unintended kind of nervous energy into your horse.
And I think I have to imagine horses we know this, horses get nervous too, and they don't understand the any sort of internal or external pressure that they might put on themselves to perform well, but outside stimuli makes them nervous, or can. And so if you're already dealing with a horse show with a lot going on, there's what's outside the ring, let's just imagine we're at, doesn't matter, Ring 10 in Florida, in Wellington, where there's golf carts flying by on the side of right next to the ring, right? You have spooky jumps that are in the ring that they have to jump. You have a schooling area of anywhere from 5 to 25 horses that you're trying to navigate through with people. And you hope that you're at a point where your horse has been in the routine enough to, and we don't know how they think so much, but okay, we're in this arena, we're jumping jumps, we're going to go into this arena. I don't know if they even think that far, maybe not. But if you add on the fact that as a rider, there's someone on top of you and they're moving around a lot, or their motions on the mouth are different than what they normally are because they're gripping and then they're letting go and they're inconsistent, and then they're asking for different speeds. Imagine how that must feel. I mean, adding to all the other stimuli that they have to deal with. I'm sure that's tremendously, pressure fueling.
Right. I have to imagine, especially if it's a horse that knows you really well and that you ride, it's your horse that you
Yep.
ride every day. And it's like, oh, I know what to expect from
Yes.
this person, and this is how they feel. And then all of a sudden that's very different in a kind of sharper or more tense way. And again, what they're getting is maybe they don't care about the golf cart, but they really care that you're panicking about something.
Sure.
Well, I don't really know what we're supposed to be afraid of, but clearly
Something.
it's important.
Clearly something is wrong. So therefore they're
Right.
going to change. I'm going to change my, behavior. I'm going to get tense in my body and speed up and lock my jaw. And it can really be kind of a domino effect there. What would you say? All right, let's break this down a little bit as far as what to do for our listeners and for riders and for anybody in life that's trying to get through a tough moment.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to just be competing. What to do for when you're in that position. And I think the first thing you already said is recognizing that you're nervous. For me, and I'd love to hear your answer to follow up this. The second thing I would say is, can you identify where this pressure, if it is pressure, is coming from? Is it internal? Is it external? Is it from the fact that your parents are there and they put a lot of time and effort to get you to this point, and you really want to, be successful in what they're helping you get towards? Is it your trainer? Is it, you know what I mean? Like, what do you think? What is the first thing you would do as a rider when you're in that position?
I think that sort of analysis realistically it would not happen for me once I'm already nervous. I think that's a really good exercise to go through as sort of like a little bit of a bigger picture. It's like, okay, why am I nervous? Is this my last chance to qualify for medal finals? Am I catch riding a horse? And like, I don't want to screw that up. Am I right? Again, all of the reasons. Is this something I really want? Is this,
well, and that's actually, let's
stepping
back
up
up
in a division, right? And whatever the situations where it's sort of it's often this newness, right?
Right.
Newness plus pressure tends to make people nervous. So situations we haven't encountered before. And I think that kind of gets back to, I think that really comes back to the preparedness thing of, right? We would often get nervous when it's like, oh, you only get to go to the medal finals once a year. That's sort of, I don't get, even if you do that for 4 years, that's not many times for that to become, not new in that way. And so I think having that feeling like you're prepared, right? Oh, I'm stepping up to the high juniors, like, oh boy. And if you feel really underprepared for that, that's gonna both exacerbate, make you more nervous and make it more likely that you kind of fall into that sort of frantic nervousness.
Right.
So I think in the moment it would be more of a management of the nerves, but I think
you're not having this full conversation with yourself.
Yeah, but if you're you and you're getting nervous a week out, I think you've got plenty of time for that conversation with yourself.
That's true. Okay, this is what I needed then.
When I'm on deck, right?
Yeah.
It's more like, so.
Well, there you go. So if you're able to identify the fact that, and my nerves would start as just anxiety. I think those do go together. They're different terms, but I would notice if I was nervous leading up to an event, a lot of time out, it would start as just how I feel, feeling anxious. And sometimes I would just start feeling anxious and not really be able to pinpoint why. And until I started thinking, oh yeah, I have that coming up. That's in the back of my mind. I haven't let myself address it yet. So my body is telling me that I need to pay attention. And I think then the conversation like you just went through is, where does this come from? Sometimes there's pressure or nerves that come from unrealistic pressure, or not, I'm sorry, not unrealistic, but unimportant. And I think that if that's something like, even now, I didn't deal with this as a junior, but all my friends on social media are winning all these classes, so therefore I have to too. Or, my trainer told me that, that would be a no-brainer for me to do well in that class, but can I really do that? I think that you have to identify how important something is to you, and if that matters now and if that matters long term. You had an example that you wanted to bring up, right? About that 10-10-10 theory.
Oh, yeah, this is something actually mom used to say, I think brought up, and I found it, it's very easy, it's very simple. It's a very simple idea of like, how will this really, I think the outcome, right? If you're nervous about
Sure.
class, or you're nervous about, again, like for me, it's like, oh, if I'm about to have like a tough conversation with somebody that I care about, right? It's like the outcome of that, or give a talk at a conference, that the source of the nervousness. It's like, okay, how will the outcome of this thing that I'm getting nervous about affect me or my life or others in, what is it, I think 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years.
Okay.
And so it's also used as kind of a decision, right? Framework of like, I need to decide A versus B, and how will doing, A instead of B have those short and long-term effects. But I think
What
you
the
can
up and
apply
up.
it
I like that. Yeah.
in this case of like, okay, in terms of kind of regulating, how much pressure and how important this thing is. Because a lot of times when we get nervous, it kind of, we don't really differentiate between the little, like, oh, I'm just in this moment nervous for like this thing that isn't really going to matter tomorrow, but it's new and I feel unprepared and I'm just a little nervous, versus like these big things that we've worked, maybe years to get up to, and are important even in the long term. So I think having that to help kind of scale how, not how valid, but maybe how serious to take
How big
your
of a deal it
nerves,
is to you. Yeah. Right.
to really, again, keep that
In
short and
perspective.
long term. Yeah, keep that exactly. Keep the perspective of how important is this to me in the short term and the long term. And does that help? Just even that mental exercise help you kind of manage your nerves, especially for if it is more of a, oh, this is important and I care about this, but in the scheme of my life or this year, like it's not a huge deal.
Right. Right. And you come, I think afterward, it's easy to look back and say, oh, that wasn't a huge deal. I shouldn't have been so nervous. But in the moment, so many things can feel like a big deal. And they don't even have to be big competitions or big classes to win. It could be, like you said, your first time moving up to a higher height of jumping. That can be physically scary, and you haven't done that before. And you might be, putting in your homework in terms of lessons and showing, but when it comes down to it, those jumps look big when you, and I don't care what height you're moving up from, whether it's 3 foot to 3.6, or whether it's 4 meter 20 to meter 30. When those jumps look bigger, that's just another intimidation to process. And I think it's like you said, your preparation as a rider needs to be at the forefront of your brain when you're staring those jumps down and going, do I really want to do this? Is this really what I said I was ready for? Am I ready for it? And sometimes the answer is no. There's nothing wrong with walking a course and realizing that the way the course is set is just a 5 degrees further into your riding education than you are where you are. And that's not, you're not quite there yet. So let's take a step back. Let's go do more homework until we are there. Or you do enter the class, you do jump around, assuming, you're all still on by the time you leave. What have you learned from that? And how can you deal with it to prevent that overwhelming nervous feeling before the next event?
Yeah. And yeah, no, I think that's good advice. And something a lot of people it's hard. It's I think naturally we're pretty unwilling to do that, and to say no, to take that step back even before we even walk in the ring. That feels like a small failure, right? That feels like, oh, I thought I was not, and to reframe it as a really sort of intentional and self-aware choice, both for you and, again, in this case, an animal that's relying
an animal
on you to not put you as a pair in a situation that collectively you're unprepared for, whether it's, a young horse or a young rider or both, or lack of experience. And I think really, setting one thing we haven't really touched on, we touched on a little bit with the pressure, but really a source of of nerves as expectations. And you talked about this a little bit with the Derby finals, because on one hand, sometimes when things are just new, right? And they, like I said, that can be a source of nerves. But sometimes it's not the newness, it's new expectations, right? I remember the first time I went to the medal finals when I really had no business being there, even though it was new, because there were no expectations, I don't remember feeling I'm sure I was a little nervous because it's like my first time indoors, but it's a very different sort of excited, nervous of like, I get to, do this new thing versus 3 years later when the expectations are so high. It's like, that's a very different kind of pressure. So is it sort of this nervous excitement from something that's new and different, or is that kind of like manufactured nerves from really, really, and sometimes unreasonably high expectations? Like, again, identifying like, okay, why am I nervous? And those can look very different.
I think expectations are the biggest thing people can work through and talk through. If you can understand what expectations you're putting on yourself and what expectations others are putting on you and whose expectations are realistic to live up to. And why, and that's the next question is why, why do you have that expectation for yourself? And many times that expectation can be you've already, like you said, your first year at age 14, we went to the medal finals and none of us had any expectations aside from, we all hope you manage around the course without being, and the thing is, we were kind of actually expecting it to go at a B- C+ rate, right? So in terms of, riding scores, let's say that's around somewhere in the 70s. And really all that meant was you made your way around the course. You didn't go off course. You didn't fall off. You probably did the right numbers.
Yeah.
And there were no disasters that led to, because we know how that kind of environment one small mistake can lead to a lot of big mistakes. So I'm sure, I don't remember the round itself, but I'm sure you made a lot of small errors, but you managed it quite well for your age at that point. And then I think the years later, when you were then expected to at least get a top 10 ribbon, I don't remember ever asking the question, well, why? Well, the first answer is because you ride well enough to do so. And you've put in so much time that I hate using the word deserve. I think that's a very vague term, but you have worked hard enough to allow for that to be a true possibility. But I think for expectation to be, I'm expecting to win this final is, now you're talking rolling the dice and getting lucky too, and luck, we can't control that. There's so many elements in riding that we can't control. We can only control what we do as humans.
Yeah. And frankly, I think for me, looking back on this is sort of the focusing on the equitation finals and the years I went, and it was that first year. And then it was a year that I think I did get a top 10 ribbon medal finals. So then as soon as that happens, that's the bar, right? As soon as
then you have to beat it. Exactly.
That's the bar in every final you go to. And then the next, but I was still quite young. Like that was like, oh wow, we didn't expect this. This is very cool.
It was above our expectations. Right.
Congratulations, that's now your bar.
Right.
Here's your
don't
ribbon.
Have the same expectations for next year. You got to beat
don't
that.
Get a lower one next time. Yeah. And then the next year, I guess I would have been 15. And that was really the first year, like I'd won a lot during the year. And that was really like, top 3 ribbons.
Okay, as a rider, yeah.
The expectation. And my whole fall went terribly. And it wasn't that I rode badly. It was a lot of like Tommy was great. I think I had a rail. It was, and it was like these kind of, I don't want to say small things, but like I had a rail at the medal finals and that knocked me out. Tommy spooked on the flat. McClay, it was like these kind of things where it's like I'd have a really nice round and then something would happen. Something lucky, unlucky, if you will, a little bit out of my control would happen. And so I don't think I got a ribbon that year. Maybe when
even where you just say that, like, I don't think I got a ribbon, you're trying to remember it, but isn't that crazy, or isn't that so much of a change from the year before, of because you got one ribbon in a final of that's usually at least 150 people, medal finals can get close to 300, that is now an expectation and that's a given, and to fall anywhere under that is a failure. And I think you could change, let's take medal finals and your level of riding out of it. I think you can apply that to any rider where expectation is immediate pressure, and pressure then is what causes these nerves. And anytime, even if you rode like you didn't have any nerves, and maybe you did have classes where you went in there, you're like, I'm just not nervous. This is nothing to me. I can do this in my sleep, which is another real skill. And it's not even a talent, I think, but I think that's a skill that we haven't talked about that people can work on, of how to approach things as if it's, easy as pie, but that most of us have these internal nerves that come from all this external pressure. So, and you're right, expectation is probably pressure number one for that.
Yeah. I think, the expectations, but just like having a really unlucky year, honestly, was, in hindsight, a fantastic sort of reset of expectations, a little bit, right? Just enough to come back the next year and come into that kind of being like, like all sorts of things can happen. And it really did, honestly, I think. And the next year was when I won the medal in clay finals, I do remember
perhaps because you had that attitude,
just being a little bit like, I'm not expecting anything. And like, again, in the back of your mind, it could, but in the forefront, it's kind of like, all sorts of things can happen. And I think having a little more realistic expectations of, it's like, I can do everything I can do, but there's all of these factors I can't control. And that's just, so there, I understand that they're going to have to line up, and there's only so much I can do.
Well, that was a fun chat, Kimmy, about how we can really handle nerves. And I have a special guest for next time. A sports psychologist who has worked in the horse industry for a while is going to bring us his professional opinions on all of this stuff. So I think that'll be a great follow-up. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Show Jumping Podcast, everyone. Be sure to join our Facebook group, Overheard on the Show Jumping Podcast, and submit your riding questions there. Keep your eyes up and your heels down.